Okay, let's now look at number 6 in the book, which is a good example of a dangling modifier. I think you'll see these ones very quickly, but I just want to quickly remind you because they're very common. So we've got the comma here from the first clause, turning away from literary realism to write romantic stories about the peasant life and landscape of northern Sweden. We don't want that there, do we, in 1909, because it stops Selma Lagerlöf, who is the writer who is being described in the participle clause. We need Selma Lagerlöf right next to that comma. So A is not correct. Let's come down to B. She turned away from literary realism and wrote romantic stories about the peasant life and landscape of northern Sweden. And novelist Selma Lagerlöf in 1909 became the first woman as well as the first Swedish writer that won the Nobel Prize for Literature. Now, I hope you can hear that it sounds like there's two women here when you have she first of all and then and novelist Selma Lagerlöf. So there's a lot of ambiguity there by using she first and then novelist Selma Lagerlöf. So straight away I would get rid of that. There's no antecedent anyway for she, so there's only a later word. So let's get rid of B. Let's come on to C. Selma Lagerlöf was a novelist who turned away from literary realism to write romantic stories about the peasant life and landscape of northern Sweden, and in 1909 she became the first woman in addition to the first Swedish writer winning the Nobel Prize for Literature. Now, I hope you can see that this winning, if it were going to be a participle clause describing the previous clause, then describing the first Swedish writer, describing Selma, we would need a comma. And really, this would make sense if it wasn't a gerund. This would make sense if it was to win, the first Swedish writer to win the Nobel Prize for Literature, like it was in the original sentence in A. So it can't be C. Okay, we come down to D. A novelist who turned away from literary realism to write romantic stories about the peasant life and landscape of northern Sweden. Selma Lagerlöf became in 1909 the first woman and also the first Swedish writer to win the Nobel Prize for Literature. Well, it's a difficult and long sentence, but it's okay. It's correct. And lastly, E. As a novelist, Selma Lagerlöf turned away from literary realism and wrote romantic stories about the peasant life and landscape of northern Sweden in 1909, becoming the first woman and also the first Swedish writer that won. Well, the first thing to notice is that turned away is not in parallel with becoming. If you look at the one which is correct, turned away is in parallel with became. Yeah, the past simple forms are both used there. So I think that's quite important. And I don't really like the first Swedish writer that won. Really, it would normally be to win here. That sounds like the natural idiom to me anyway. Okay, so I hope that's given you a few ideas for that question. Let's move on to another.